What is the most iconic team in NFL history? We obviously have the Cowboys and Steelers tonight with all the Hall of Fame guys going in. I would put the Packers on the list. Did that question make any sense? Who is like the most traditionally famous NFL team?
Yes, Eden.
I would put the Raiders on that list.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. But if you're talking about that, are you talking about it really started in the Super Bowl era?
Yeah.
Because the Cleveland Browns used to be the great team in the 60s. And then the Packers came along, and then the Packers won the first two Super Bowls. Plus, if you look at your fandom and where it's based, if you're an NFL fan, your dad or your grandfather, if they were a Packer fan, then your dad or you became a Packer fan. And then after that, you had the Cowboys, you had the 49ers, you had the Steelers. Like if you look at the Blue Bloods, it's your fandom is probably based off what happened in the late 60s, in the 70s, even the 80s, where you go, hey, I root for this team. Why? Well, my dad did, or my grandfather did, or I started watching when I was younger. That's where you develop your fan. If you're not in those cities, and you find this a lot with the Cowboys and the Steelers, they're all over the country. But it's based off of watching them perform at a high level, watching them win Super Bowls. Because somebody who was a Cleveland Browns fan, it's not the same. You weren't watching a Super Bowl. The Packers, when they played the Raiders and played the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, like that was a big deal. And it was Lombardi and, you know, had this threat of AFL, NFL, would there be a merger? Who had the better league? You know, there was really this territorial rights that was at stake there. And then you had the Colts against the Jets, the biggest upset we've had. And then the Kansas City Chiefs proved that that was no fluke. And then we had the merger. But your fandom is probably based off what your dad or your grandfather followed. Yeah, Paul.
You're absolutely right. It's the first thing you see as a little kid. When I was a little kid, it felt like the Steelers were always in the Super Bowl. Like the Dodgers and Yankees felt like they were always in the World Series because you compress things. But I think the Steelers were in 4 Super Bowls in 6 seasons, over a 6-season span. When I was a kid, I can remember seeing Terry Bradshaw in a Burt Reynolds movie. He felt like the face of the NFL. Or Roger Staubach was also the face of the NFL. I didn't know anything as a kid, though.
Yeah, and you got caught up in, you know, what the Cowboys, how they presented this. You had Tom Landry stoic on the sidelines, wearing the hat, nice suit. You had the Cowboy cheerleaders. You had the stadium. Then you had the Raiders, who were the complete opposite, the antithesis. Like they were not polished. They were the bad guys. They were the outlaws. They had an owner who sued the NFL. And that's where you fall in love with a story. And they became your team at that time, or it was your dad's team, and you're watching. Just by proxy, you become a fan of that team. But if you're from Pittsburgh, obviously, you love your Steelers, or San Francisco, or, you know, does New England fit in there? We don't allow them in because they weren't winning back, you know, in the 70s. They were the laughing stock. But it feels like you have to almost have started in the late 60s, early 70s to be on that list of, iconic franchises, even though, you know, Patriots more successful than anybody winning Super Bowls. Yeah, Club.
But even in 20 years, when these kids of Patriots fans I don't think the next generation is going to look back at them as a great team.
Well, the Patriots aren't beloved around the country. That's another thing. I mean, that's, you know, provincial. Whereas for some reason, Packer fans, Steeler fans, Cowboys, Raiders, that's all over the country. Yes, Eden.
And so much of it is NFL films,
Yeah.
right? All of these iconic teams that we're talking about, we have grainy footage, old footage of them to this like triumphant music and, you know, the slow motion and all of that. You don't really have that with the Patriots necessarily.
Yeah, NFL films really formed my viewing patterns, my rooting patterns, the storylines, because at the time when we were growing up, we didn't have all the games, but we just absorbed NFL films. And Howard Cosell on Monday Night Football would give you 3 minutes of highlights. That's the only time you would see a team or a player. Now you get to see whoever you want whenever you want to see them. But back then, the importance of what NFL films did to football glamorized it and presented it in a way sports had never been presented before. And I think because of that, your fandom was based off of something as small as the NFL Films doing a feature on your team. Yeah, Paulie.
Another difference is the Patriots dynasty is basically Belichick and Brady, and they mixed up other players. Over the years, there's a bunch of different wide receivers and running backs, and defenders came and went. That Steeler team, everyone in this room can name all their players off the top of your head because it was like a 10-year run, and they kept everybody. Their defense, their offense. Guys didn't do free agency back then. It was on the cusp of free agency, so that Steeler team was basically intact for about 8 years.
Yeah, and, we didn't have free agency back then. You were drafted by a team, and you stayed with your team until they cut you. And you had that with Green Bay, that you knew Bart Starr was going to be there. And, Jim Taylor and Paul Hornung, Herb Adderley. You had all of those great players who was on the Kansas City Chiefs, and Hank Stram. The Raiders. You knew that Kenny Stabler, Darryl LaMonica, Fred Biletnikoff. Like, you just had Lyle Alzado, John Madden, Al Davis. These were true characters, but you had interchangeable parts, and then the team stayed relevant. With the Cowboys, you had Roger Staubach, and then after that, you would have Troy Aikman. The Steelers would have Terry Bradshaw. Then eventually, you would have Ben Roethlisberger. The Packers, you've gone from Bart Starr to Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers and remained relevant for 50 years. Now, they did have dips, but for the most part, you had a Hall of Fame quarterback there.